PSY213 class. So now we're going to talk about autobiographical memory. So here we're talking about episodic memory in its purest form, right? Memory for your own life events. And so I usually like to start this lecture by just sort of asking you some questions, and maybe you could pause the video here and just sort of think about it before you hear my response to it. But my first question for you is, how do we date autobiographical events? So think about that. Like if I were to ask you to recall an autobiographical event, and then I were to ask you, when did that happen? How would you answer that question? Well, most of the time, people tend to use other significant events. So a lot of times, it'll start with personal events. So you might remember the year that you graduated high school, the year you started college, maybe the year that you graduated college, and so on. Maybe the year you started a particular job, and you anchor around those dates and sort of do the math before or after those particular dates. Another possibility, though, is people can use external significant events, right? So, critical dates in history, right? So sometimes people use the eruption of Mount St. Helens, the Challenger explosion, the year Reagan was shot, the year John Lennon was shot, Princess Diana when she died, 9/11, etc. They could use particular events. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, about external sort of historical events when we talk about flashbulb memories. So, what's your earliest memory? So, if I ask you, what's your earliest memory? Most of the time, people report pretty early memories, but generally nothing before the age of 3. This is something that's called infantile amnesia. And it's probably most likely due to brain development, such that you really don't have the areas of the brain that are going to promote these really long, durable, long term memories. They're not really developed until right around age 3. If you do have memories before then, it's probably been constructed out of details that have been encountered in other places, like maybe people telling stories and you filling in those details. There's been a couple of good studies that sort of have looked at this and suggest that you really can't remember much before the age of 3. So, how accurate are our autobiographical memories? That's a real good question. Because obviously we remember lots of things. How do we know what's accurate or not? Now, measuring the accuracy in the lab is very challenging. And if you think about it, the reason why should sort of reveal itself, right? Because you could recall any event in your past, and we would have no real way of verifying the accuracy of that. You might be have vivid recall of it. You might be convinced that it actually happened, but unless we can like go back in time, we have this problem of verifying the accuracy. There are some circumstances, some cases, and some studies that follow people over time. But as you imagine, those longitudinal studies are very difficult to conduct. You have to collect a lot of information. You have to track people down, and that takes a lot of time. And a lot of times, there's not a lot of rewards in doing studies that take that kind of length of time. But that's what it would take in order to sort of verify the accuracy. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about some of these issues, but I do want to talk about a few interesting studies that tell us a few things about autobiographical memory. And I first I want to tell you about this Winkleman et al. Study. And so what they did was really pretty interesting. It's a different slant on your typical autobiographical memory. What they did is they had people recall either 4 events. So this was 2 different groups of participants. So they were asked to either recall 4 events from their childhood or 12 events from your childhood. So imagine how you would do that. Like if you could recall 4 events, do you think that would be easy? Do you think that would be hard? Most people would say recalling this 12 events is pretty hard. Like you can come up with 4 pretty easily, but 12 you start racking your brain and you start sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel, if you will, to come up with events in your childhood. Well, after they did this task, they then just asked them one simple question. Regarding your childhood memory, are there large parts of your childhood after age which you can't remember? And as you might imagine, the group that recalled more were much more likely to say that their autobiographical memory was worse. Now, think about what's happening there. They've actually recalled more out of their childhood memory, and yet they're more likely to say, yeah, my memory is not that good. Now, the reason being is you might have a better opportunity to sort of evaluate how difficult this was. Getting 12 events was difficult, so that gives you evidence that, yeah, things aren't so great there. And what this gets at is something called meta memory, right? So meta memory, we also have metacognition. So this is meta memory is memory for your memory. So we have knowledge about our own abilities, and in this case, your memory, right? So this gets at sort of meta memory. That's why I like to talk a little bit about it. Another interesting study was Brewer 1988. What they did is they recorded, or they gave people beepers. So beepers, you probably don't know about this anymore, but these were these little devices that you could carry around with you, and they could go off. And when they went off, they usually left a number, and that number you would call the person or do something based on that number. And so the participants carried around these beepers, and when the beeper went off, they were instructed to record what he or she was doing. So you might say something like, I was looking for a parking space. The frequency of that activity, I look for parking every day at this time. Significance of that activity, I really want a parking space, so this is really important. In his or her emotional state, there aren't many parking spots, so I was sort of angry. So then what they did is they brought people back and they tested their memory immediately, same day, 23 days or 46 days, and they were given one of these 4 pieces of information as a cue. So they used these pieces of information as a cue to look at their recollections. Now, what they found is that many times, as you might imagine yourself in this research study, but as you might imagine, many times nothing could be recollected. So they were given a cue and they were like, yeah, I don't remember that at all. Many times the wrong event was produced. So what this tells us, these 2 little pieces, tell us that people mostly forget or they guess when the researcher sort of is prompting them to recall something. So that's probably characterizes most our autobiographical memories. There's lots of things that we don't really care about. So imagine every time you went to the grocery store. You don't keep that. Most of the time it's uneventful and there's no reason to remember those trips to the store, so you sort of forget or dump that information. Now, to add on to this, there were a lot of correct recollections, so people could remember, but very few times the correct event was recalled with wrong information. So rarely were people recalling things that weren't accurate. So in general, you probably forget most of what happens in your life, but when you do remember, it's mostly accurate. Or at least, as we'll see, you remember the gist very well, the gist or the general details, but you tend to forget the individual details. We'll see this theme continue to emerge when we talk about retrieval. This is generally true, whether we're talking about autobiographical memory or other forms of memory. Our memory is really good at remembering core key details, the gist, but it's pretty bad at remembering individual tiny little details. So it doesn't serve us well in those situations. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you retrieve an autobiographical event over and over again, like you reminisce extensively, that extensive reminiscing can lead to distortions or changes in your memory. Remember, we talked about consolidation, and we talked about how consolidation can lead to reconsolidation, right? Where your memories, you retrieve them, they become updated and then restored. So this reminiscing can lead to changes and of the original memory in ways that are inaccurate. So we'll talk more about this in distortions of memory, and autobiographical memory is a prime example of one of these sorts of things that's subject to distortions. So we'll talk a little bit about it here, but that's generally true. So what about flashbulb memories? You may have heard this term, flashbulb memories. And so Brown and Kuklik, they introduced this, and this is an exceptionally vivid memory of significant events. And they pointed out that it's like a snapshot from a camera. So people will report having a vivid memory around some typically external historical event. And it's like they froze that moment in time like a picture, so hence the name flashbulb, going off and capturing that image. So Brown and Kuklik studied the JFK assassination and people's recollections about what was happening or what their memories were when they learned about when JFK was assassinated. We've also had people study flashbulb memories by the Challenger disaster. So this is when the astronauts went up in the space shuttle Challenger and it exploded on launch. That created a flashbulb memory for a lot of people. You might be more familiar with 9/11. This also was a significant event and created flashbulb memory-like experiences. Now, one key issue, so there's evidence for and against having these sorts of flashbulb memories. And one of the things that is important here is it depends on when the memory is first measured. So the idea here is you're measuring something at time one. So if an event happens, a significant historical event happens, memory researchers will go in and they'll have you record what was happening, what was all of the details that were going on during that event, and then they test your memory later on at some distant time down the road, and they compare your first recollection with your second recollection for accuracy, right? So remember the original problem here with autobiographical memories. How do we know? If you're recounting a story about what happened on 9/11, how do we know that that's true or not? Unless you have a record or unless you have some way of verifying it, you don't know. So the way memory researchers did this is they would sample at time one and sample at time two and compare them. So the early studies in flashbulb memories, they would sample a few days after the event, right? So a few days after the JFK assassination or the Challenger disaster, and they would show a lot less changes in their memories over time. And this suggested that people did have sort of a vivid photographic quality to these memories. However, if you sample a few hours after the event, and Ulrich Neisser did a really good job around the Challenger disaster, where he sampled his students a few hours after the event, he found that a lot of the details changed over time. So probably what's happening is if within a few days of whatever this historical event is you're reorganizing and altering your memories a whole lot within those first few days. And so if you think about it, you're talking to people, you're processing what happened, you're thinking about it, and every time you're reminiscing or thinking about it, that can lead to changes in your memory. But after a few days, that starts to settle down, gets consolidated, and then the memories are more stabilized after that point. But the idea is that those memories are changing quite a lot within the first few days, and so there's really no evidence that we have these flashbulb memories. They're subjected to the same kinds of distortions our other memories are. It's just that they settle out a little bit faster and they become more vivid because they're historic events, so there's more details around them associated because they're historical kinds of events. So I do have another video I want you to watch, so I'm going to, this is a point where I would pause, and in this video they're going to talk about some of these issues with flashbulb memories and give you some more details about what I was just talking about. So I'll have that link in Canvas for you. Pause this video, watch that video, and then come back and we'll pick up our discussion. So just to recap what you've learned about flashbulb memories, it is a vivid emotional memory, perhaps enhanced. These emotional memories are enhanced by adrenaline. However, they're subject to the same reconstructive processes that distort other memories. It's definitely not a photographic record, even if you think it feels like a photographic record. We're really good at remembering the gist, the overall details, but the specific details, like what you would expect in a photographic record, get changed quite a lot. Remember what they talked about in the video there, the continuity errors in film, right? We don't preserve all of the tiny little details, so we don't even notice those continuity errors in the film. So it's not a photographic record. What we're always doing when we're living our lives and forming memories is we're extracting the gist. We're like meaning extraction machines. That's what our brain is highly tuned to retain, find meaning, retain that meaning, and keep that meaning. But it's not saving those individual details like you would expect in a photographic record. As a matter of fact, we don't have any evidence that there was anybody with a photographic like memory. We have people with exceptional memories, but not a photographic memory where everything is stored. That's more of a myth, right? So on this note, you might be thinking, hey, I've heard about some people with highly superior autobiographical memories. Even certain characters are presumed, like Sherlock Holmes was presumed to sort of have a perfect memory. No evidence that that exists, but there are people with what's been called highly superior autobiographical memory, or HSAM, or HSAM for short. So what I'm going to do is have you watch two videos. So there's two videos, a part one and a part two, that introduce you to these people, and you can sort of see more about their story. We'll come back here and I'll wrap things up because there's been some research since these 60 minutes episodes have been done. We've learned a little bit more about people with HSAM, and so I'll just sort of summarize all that up for you. So pause this video here, watch both parts, and come back and get this last little bit in autobiographical memory. Okay, so after you've watched those videos, so one thing I want to ask you or point out to you is, like, there is a value in forgetting, right? And this is talked about in Moonwalking with Einstein, right? And also you saw it in the film there, so, or in the videos about Sam, that one thing that's important is we have painful events happen to us. And it's really important for us, for our healing, to be able to forget some of those details. And so we lose a lot of the vividness over time, right? The time heals all wounds concept. So to get over emotional trauma, it's really important to be able to forget. And so you saw in the video, they relive their painful memories, which is not necessarily a good thing. The other thing that was talked about in Moonwalking with Einstein, right, is patient S, who had this amazing memory, but had an inability to abstract and generalize, right? So part of what our memories are tuned to doing is look for patterns across many things. And if you're remembering all of the individual details, you're not going to see the general patterns, right? So sometimes people describe this as not seeing the forest through the trees kind of concept, right? So our ability to abstract and generalize depends in part on losing details of individual events. So forgetting is a pretty good thing. And we'll talk more about this in the next lecture. Well, actually, maybe after retrieval, lecture 13, when we talk about forgetting. But back to HSAM, there's further research on this, and you can see the studies here. Laporte and Pathis had some published studies. So as it turns out, HSAM people do not have superior memory for events that were not personally experienced, so just historical sorts of things. They would have to experience these events, so it's really about their own autobiographical memory. They are subject to the same false memories as everyone else. When we talk about distortions of memory, I will talk about some examples of false memory, and these same tests have been run on these HSAM patients, and they are subject to the same false memory distortions as everyone else. So the memories seem to be working the same way. Their imagination in general trends higher, and so they may be better at embellishing or creating vivid memories. And as you're going to learn, or are learning in Moonwalking with Einstein, this is really important for creating durable memories, is vividness, right? They do tend to fixate on calendar information, but they can only name dates that they've lived. So there are some autistic patients who can calendar count, who can talk about dates and time. They can only name dates that they've lived. They don't have this ability to go beyond their own lives. They do tend to score high on obsessive compulsive scales. You saw some evidence in the video. They're sort of hinting around that they may have some obsessive compulsive tendencies. And the other piece of information here is that their memory is not superior for events that are tested on the same day or previous days. So what this evidence is suggesting is that they don't necessarily have a better way of forming memories, but that they might hold on to their memories a little bit better. If you think about it, excuse me, the evidence is suggesting that they are kind of obsessive about their own memories, and so that they obsess about keeping these memories, and because they obsess about keeping these memories, they have better memory for the events in their lives. But we're still studying this. There's still much more to be learned. It's certainly a curious case. I look forward to seeing what your reactions are online to this.